Hi Year 12, welcome to your lesson on Beloved. It's going to have three parts today. Firstly, we're going to reflect on the best ideas that you guys sent in on the present tense section that you did a close reading of. I've put those in a Word document for you so that you can see all the brilliant ideas that the class have had that we're not getting to hear in school anymore, unfortunately. And so you can add to your own notes. And I know that some people were quite nervous about that because they felt that they'd kind of struggled with it and it was a bit abstract, which a lot of the novel is, to be fair. Um, and I think basically the two things to bear in mind when it comes to looking at a section like that seems quite different to other things is firstly, how does it compare with the rest of the novel? Okay, so why would the novel as a whole decide to have these two very different storytelling techniques? Why would it go from past tense to present tense? How does that make us feel as a reader? That kind of destabilizing effect it has on us. The second thing is just to generally think, why do writers use present tense? And normally it's about kind of a sense of urgency and immediacy and putting the reader right in that moment. So it's about thinking about, why is this moment so important? Why is it so you know um useful for Morrison to get us to experience this from a particular character's point of view at that time. So those are two kind of overarching questions that can help you unpick tricky bits of the novel in future when you're writing about it for your coursework. But on the whole, very impressive work from everybody. And I've basically compiled all the best ideas into kind of, I think it's like three overarching sections. So please do pause this video now and go and have a look at those and add to your notes if you're missing any of those ideas. Okay, so the second of today's objectives then is to recap the ending of the novel, which you just read over Easter, with a focus on narrative. So we started our whole study of Beloved by thinking about this narrative lens, by thinking about beginnings and endings, character, settings. How does Morrison use perspective or narrative voice? How does she use structure and gaps? What's her kind of writing style? What's her writing form? So we're going to think about those components, which are the absolute nitty gritty of literature and which are the building blocks of this subject that you guys are so good at, that you've done your whole education in English. So if you are sitting there at home thinking, God, this Marxism malarkey, this feminism lens, eco-criticism, it all just seems really tricky and abstract, I don't have a clue what that kind of tells me about Beloved, that's absolutely fine, because you can just write your essay on, say, setting or character. Okay, so we'll return to the kind of nuts and bolts of English today, because that is a very valid lens that we started with in the critical anthology. And then finally, when we finish today's lesson, I will kind of send you off down the vein that you're most interested. Okay, so back to the start. We started with a key quote from David Lloyd, which is at the bottom here in purple. And he said, "The beginning of a novel is a threshold separating the real world we inhabit from the world the novelist has imagined." So way back at the beginning of our work, we thought about this narrative lens. And basically, I just wondered if your thoughts on that had changed now that you've finished the novel. So, to what extent do you think David Lodge's quote is true of Beloved? And I split that into two further questions. So, how far does Morrison seek to separate the reader from the real world? Does she want us to be really aware that this is fiction and made up? Or does she want us to think of the reality of the events? And then, how does she do that, particularly in that opening? So, now that you finish the novel, it's a really good idea to go back to think about how it started so you can see it as a kind of structured whole. I also wanted to introduce this second quote, which is also from your critical anthology from C. Brooker, which says, "Stories begin with an event or summons that provides the call, which will lead the hero or heroine out of their initial state into a series of adventures or experiences which, to a greater or lesser extent, will transform their lives." And I wondered if you thought that was true of Beloved. So who or what is summoned, and by what or whom? Whose life has been transformed in this novel, and how was it transformed? So although these quotes are about beginnings, I think they're really useful questions to think about now that you've finished the novel, now that you've come to the end. So please pause this slide and have a think about those bold questions for me, please, and make some notes. Okay, so the rest of this lesson is just basically me going through the stuff that you should have read over Easter so that hopefully you understand the story, because as I say, Beloved is quite a tricky book. You should feel so proud, guys, that you have managed not only to read it and understand it and say such intelligent things about it, but you've managed to do that pretty much single-handedly on your own at home. Wow. please bear in mind that this is a well-esteemed book. You know that it's won awards from a very, very intelligent writer. It's something that people write about at university level. It's things that, it's something that's commented on by people with PhDs, professors are writing about this novel, and you guys are doing it such good justice at A level. So I am blown away. Well done for getting to grips with something so tricky and mostly independently. So, the end of part 2, I just wanted to kind of recap what happened before the section that you read over Easter. And basically, we kind of picked up, didn't we, with these 3 monologues. So we returned to the present tense, which is another section of the novel that links to all that close analysis that you've started today's lesson thinking about. Because there were 3 streams of consciousness, 3 inner monologues, yeah? So we heard from, firstly, Seth. Now, her voice is very fragmented. It's not standard English. It doesn't have paragraphs. It shifts in address. So sometimes she seems to be talking about to Beloved, and sometimes she seems to be talking to other characters, or maybe just herself. But in that monologue, she recognises and reclaims Beloved and basically blames Paul D for it taking so long for her to notice it was her daughter. It's a very repetitive monologue. It blurs the past and the present like Seth does a lot. And it's all about motherhood and daughterhood. And basically her chief emotion in her monologue is one of guilt. And then the second monologue we get is Denver's. And hers is much more standardised than her mother's. Oh, we're missing an apostrophe there, how annoying. And it's organised into paragraphs, and maybe that's indicative of the fact that she has been more educated than her mother. So as we know, she went to Lady Jones and she was taught things and she was really good at school. So she claims Beloved as her sister. So there's almost this kind of fight going on between the 2 monologues about who Beloved kind of most belongs to and who's going to claim ownership of her. And she remembers being a lonely child with only the ghost for company. And she was such a lonely child because, of course, her brothers ran away. But she spent her whole childhood basically scared of the only family that she had. Yeah, so she was really worried about living with a killer, essentially. So her kind of primal urge now then is to protect her sister. So she spent her whole childhood waiting for her father to return. And she just wants to be a family unit with Beloved and her dad without Seth. Her chief emotion then is one of fear and also of longing. And that's where we kind of finished reading before Easter. So you picked up then with Beloved's monologue. I am beloved. Now her voice is perhaps the most disjointed of them all. There's no punctuation, it's very disorienting. It's a little bit like that opening. We talked a lot about how we weren't meant to feel secure and we were meant to feel like we didn't belong in this world. So we're feeling those similar emotions in this section at the end of part 2. She revisits many episodes that we've already read from her point of view, and therefore she seems kind of timeless. So Beloved is this embodiment of the past that invades the present, and this idea that you can't separate the 2. Her voice actually, though, becomes increasingly standardized. So there's another chapter from her point of view, and she actually uses punctuation in that one. So just like she, I suppose, learns how to become adult as a character, her language kind of changes and formalizes and kind of falls in with the rules, if you will. Her view, though, is quite infantile and incomplete, and she can't separate herself from Seth. So she says, I am not separate from her. She is my face smiling at me. It's almost like she's retreated back to the womb. She's at this very kind of early stage of development, if you know anything about psychology and Freud, where you're very kind of attached to your mother. And again, we have this conflation of birth and death. So Beloved is describing her birth, but she also seems to be describing the middle passage of slaves. So she talks about, for instance, being together with kind of dead people and seeing one mother kind of jumping overboard and that kind of thing. It's pretty traumatic. Morrison has said that Beloved speaks the language of the middle passage and of death because the language is the same for both experiences. So for Morrison, the middle passage where slaves were brought over on the boat is just death. Okay. Now this blue box is quite challenging but really interesting, I think, particularly if you're thinking of doing a feminist lens, because feminists might argue that Beloved's language reflects that children, before they succumb to patriarchal dictates of formal language, perceive the world through a female language that has a different set of rules. So an example of that would be the fact that it shuns a linear time scale. So Beloved says all of it is now. So she doesn't follow these kind of patriarchal guidelines and standards of society until she kind of, I suppose, grows and develops and is socialized in that kind of masculine way of thinking, you might say. So theorists that you might want to look into for that are Freud, Lacan, and Christeva. Okay, so the rest of part two then ends with Paul D drinking on the church steps. He remembers Sixo's death and the escape from Sweet Home. Really exciting bit, that, isn't it? Really well structured, really high tension, partly because of that repetition of the prefix but, which gives us this kind of sense of impending doom. There's much focus on masculinity and on the price he would fetch and on being shackled. I think the price, hearing himself, in kind of monetary value rather than kind of the value of a person, is the thing that is almost Paul D's undoing. I feel like a lot of these characters have a kind of breaking point, don't they? So Paul D's is hearing his price in the same way that Hal's was watching Seth's attack, in the same way that Seth's was when school teacher put her animalistic characteristics on one side of the page. So they all have this kind of psychological breaking point where they just believe they can't kind of take anymore. And then we have Stampede, who's really developing as a character as the novel goes on, trying to fix the damage that he's caused between Paul D and Seth. So he's the one who showed him the newspaper report, who told him what Seth did. And he tells Paul D that he's welcome at any black person's home and explains why he's renamed himself Stampede when his owner raped his wife. So basically he says, I've paid my dues now and I don't owe anybody anything. And he kind of sees himself as a free man. What I found really disturbing, I suppose, about that encounter is that Stampede says that he has kind of paid the ultimate price, and he doesn't really think about maybe the fact that his wife paid that price for him. So I think if you're looking at either masculinity or femininity and the different ways that men and women experience slavery, that section is really, really interesting in terms of, I don't know, how the two seem to blur there, and what his wife suffers seems to be the same kind of injury done to him, and seems to liberate him in a way that maybe it never does for his wife. And then you had part three. So, look how I haven't put part three all in bold. That's annoying. In part three, Beloved basically starts to swell, doesn't she? So she ends up looking pregnant by the end. And as she gets bigger, Seth degenerates. And their whole dynamic just seems to be quite corrupted. So Beloved blackmails Seth, who's kind of performing this like service role. Basically, Beloved barking out the orders and Seth doing exactly what she says. So it's almost as if Seth has become the kind of child and Beloved has become the mother. But then it helps Denver's allegiance switch, doesn't it? So where she was once claiming Beloved as a sister and feeling very protective over her from Seth, now she sees, actually, I need to do something to help my mum. So she decides to go out into the community. So she begins with Lady Jones, who was her teacher, and then slowly but surely lots of women in the community kind of come out of the woodwork and start leaving food parcels with little notes. And of course, only Denver would be able to read those notes because she's the only one in that house who's educated to that degree. And then we have this scene, which is almost a kind of full circle from an earlier scene in the novel. So we have Mr. Bodwin approaching 124, and we can hear his thoughts, a bit like when school teacher gives his perspective of the murder. So it's another kind of white person's thoughts and white person approaching down the road to 124 that's obviously going to unnerve Seth. And the sky is the same blue as when Baby Suggs smells disapproval. The chestnut trees recall the clearing. The hummingbirds recall the woodshed murder. So it's almost as if all of the novel is suddenly kind of culminating in this one event in part three. It's like all these memories are suddenly all together in the present as this white man approaches 124. And because the present seems to be replaying the past, Seth attacks Mr. Bodwin with an ice pick as a symbol of the white man's violence against black women, or the man without skin, as Beloved refers to him. So basically, Seth almost kind of makes the same mistake again, if you will. She almost replays history and attacks who she sees somebody is kind of infringing and trespassing on their territory. So this whole idea of kind of thresholds and men coming to the very female space of 124, which is what the novel opened with Paul D's arrival, we've come kind of full circle, haven't we? So we've got Seth kind of pushed to her limits yet again. So that is everything that you have read over Easter, and I hope that you've kind of understood it. The final thing is that Beloved disappears, and here, boy, the dog returns. Mr. Bodwin's trying to sell the house. He saw Beloved, but the women deny seeing her. They saw Seth trying to attack him, but Mr. Bodwin is kind of downplaying that. And then we have Paul D meeting Denver, who looks like Hal, and she seems quite grown up and quite courteous towards him for a change. And he decides to go and visit Seth. And then we have that lovely kind of reconstitutive scene at the end where Seth has no room to imagine, let alone plan for the next day. So she doesn't really ever plan in the novel, does she? So plans to escape Sweet Home, the ghost's plan with the white dress, all these plans seem to kind of, cause damage. So she doesn't and she doesn't plan anymore. But now that past has been exercised. So Paul D says they should create some kind of tomorrow and tells her that Seth is her best thing, not beloved. So nice happy ending.